There are people walking among you who look completely normal. They smile, they greet you, they blend in with everyone else. But behind that calm face, something darker may be operating. Today, an X-witch is exposing the secrets they never wanted you to know, the chilling ways you can spot a witch when you see one. Because once you understand these signs, you will never look at certain people the same way again. The first sign is something most people ignore, but once you recognize it, you will never unsee it again. It begins with the eyes. An ex-witch once confessed something disturbing. She said the first thing witches are trained to master is how to observe people without being noticed. Not normal observation, but spiritual scanning. When someone operating in witchcraft enters a room, they are not simply looking at faces. They are studying energy, weakness, fear, spiritual openings. And the easiest way to do that is through the eyes. Have you ever felt someone staring at you long before you even looked in their direction? That strange moment when your body senses something, and when you turn around, someone is already looking directly at you? That feeling is not random. Many people involved in occult practices are trained to maintain long, penetrating eye contact because it allows them to read emotional reactions. They are studying how you respond. Do you look away quickly? Do you feel uncomfortable? Do you become nervous? To them, these reactions are not small things. They are spiritual information. One former witch revealed that during gatherings, they would often test people by locking eyes with them silently, not speaking, not smiling, just watching, waiting to see who became uneasy first. Why? Because discomfort can reveal spiritual sensitivity. And witches are often looking for people whose spiritual defenses are weak, distracted, or completely absent. You may think this sounds extreme, but spiritual warfare is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, subtle, and psychological. Another disturbing confession came from an ex-occult practitioner who explained something even deeper. She said witches are often trained to control facial expressions completely. This means they can stare at someone without blinking much, without emotional reaction, without giving away intention. To the average person, it just feels strange. Something about the look feels off, you cannot explain it. But your instincts tell you something is wrong. And here is something important you must understand. The human spirit can detect spiritual danger. Long before the mind processes it, the spirit feels it. This is why sometimes you meet someone for the first time and instantly something inside you becomes uncomfortable. You cannot explain why. They have done nothing wrong. They may even be smiling politely. But deep inside, something warns you. That warning should never be ignored. Many believers dismiss these moments. They say things like, maybe I'm just imagining things, or I'm probably overthinking. But spiritual discernment often begins exactly like that. A quiet inner signal. A feeling you cannot logically explain. Ex-witches have said that the biggest advantage occult practitioners have is how unaware most people are. People ignore their spiritual instincts. People dismiss their intuition. People assume everything must have a logical explanation. But spiritual warfare does not always operate on visible rules. Sometimes the signs are subtle, a look that lingers too long, a stare that feels invasive, eyes that seem to be searching, analyzing, measuring you. Now listen carefully. This does not mean every person who looks at you intensely is involved in witchcraft. Discernment is not about paranoia. It is about awareness. But when someone consistently studies people in a way that feels unnatural, cold, or invasive, it is wise to pay attention. Because according to former practitioners, observation is one of the first skills witches develop. They watch people. They study patterns. They notice emotional triggers. And once they identify weakness, they know exactly where to focus spiritual influence. But there is something powerful you must understand. Darkness only operates freely when light is absent. When a believer carries spiritual authority, the atmosphere changes. Even silent prayer can disrupt spiritual monitoring. Even simple awareness can block manipulation. One former witch confessed that the most frustrating people to observe were those who prayed regularly. Because when witches tried to spiritually scan them, they often felt resistance, sometimes even fear. Why? Because prayer builds spiritual covering. It builds discernment. It strengthens your inner awareness. And when someone tries to spiritually probe you, your spirit recognizes it faster. That is why many believers feel sudden urges to pray when certain people enter their environment. It is not coincidence. Your spirit is responding to something your eyes cannot see. But here is the warning. Witches rely on one thing more than anything else: silence and ignorance. If people never recognize the signs, nothing is ever questioned, nothing is ever confronted, nothing is ever resisted. But the moment awareness awakens, their advantage begins to disappear. And that is why testimonies from former witches are so powerful. They expose the hidden tactics, they reveal what was never meant to be known, and they remind you of something very important. You are not powerless, you are not defenseless. When your spiritual awareness is awake, darkness cannot operate comfortably around you. And sometimes the very first sign something is wrong is simply the eyes watching you. The second sign is something many people have experienced but very few people understand. It is not something you see, it is something you feel. Former witches have revealed a chilling truth. When someone deeply involved in witchcraft enters a place, atmosphere can change. Not always dramatically, sometimes it is subtle. But sensitive people notice it almost immediately. Have you ever been in a room where everything felt peaceful, normal, even joyful, and then someone walked in and suddenly the environment felt heavy? No argument happened, no negative words were spoken, but the mood shifted, conversations slowed down, energy dropped. People became quiet, uneasy, distracted. That kind of shift can sometimes reveal a spiritual presence operating behind the person. One ex-witch described it this way. She said witches often carry spiritual attachments because of rituals, covenants, and occult practices. These attachments are not visible to the physical eye, but they can influence the spiritual environment. And when they enter a space where people are spiritually sensitive, the contrast becomes noticeable. It is like walking from bright sunlight into a dark tunnel. You feel the difference instantly. The air feels thicker, something becomes uncomfortable, and you cannot explain why. This is why certain individuals constantly seem to bring confusion, tension, or emotional heaviness into environments. Wherever they go, problems follow. Friend groups begin arguing. Misunderstandings increase. Peace disappears. Now listen carefully. Not every negative person is a witch. But according to ex-occult testimonies, witches often use spiritual disruption as a tool. Confusion weakens people. Conflict distracts them. Emotional exhaustion makes them spiritually vulnerable. When peace disappears, spiritual defenses begin to weaken. And this is exactly what dark influence wants. One former practitioner confessed that witches sometimes intentionally visit environments simply to observe how the spiritual atmosphere reacts to them. If the room remains calm and protected, they become uncomfortable. But if tension begins spreading quickly, they know the place is spiritually unguarded. This is why environments filled with prayer often feel completely different. Have you ever walked into a place where people regularly pray? The atmosphere feels lighter, clearer. Even people who are not religious often notice this difference. Peace becomes almost tangible. But when spiritual darkness enters a place filled with prayer, the reaction can be dramatic. Some witches feel uneasy. Others suddenly want to leave. Some become strangely irritated or restless. Why? Because spiritual light exposes darkness, and darkness does not enjoy exposure. One ex-witch described visiting a home where the family prayed every night. She said the moment she stepped inside, something felt wrong. Not wrong for the family, wrong for her. She described feeling pressure in her chest, anxiety, and an urge to leave quickly. At the time, she did not understand it. Later, she realized something powerful. The prayers in that house had created a spiritual boundary. Dark influence could not operate freely there. And when witches encounter strong spiritual protection, they often become uncomfortable. This leads to another sign many people overlook. Some individuals consistently react strangely to prayer or spiritual conversation. They become tense, dismissive, mocking, or quickly try to change the subject. Again, this does not automatically prove someone practices witchcraft. But spiritual resistance is something many ex-occult practitioners have openly admitted. Because prayer disrupts spiritual manipulation. It breaks influence. It exposes hidden intentions. And those operating in darkness do not want that. But here is the truth many believers forget. You are not meant to live in fear of spiritual warfare. You are meant to live aware of it. Fear weakens you. Awareness strengthens you. When you understand how darkness operates, you begin recognizing its patterns. And when patterns become visible, influence becomes easier to resist. So if you ever notice environments shifting strangely around certain people, if peace disappears when they arrive, if confusion spreads wherever they go, if spiritual heaviness follows them from place to place, do not ignore it. Pay attention, observe carefully, pray quietly. Because spiritual awareness is one of the strongest defenses you can have. And sometimes the atmosphere itself reveals more truth than words ever could. The third sign is something that often appears harmless at first. It feels like curiosity. It sounds like friendly conversation. But according to former witches, it can sometimes be something much more strategic. Many ex-occult practitioners have confessed that witches often seek detailed personal information about people. Not random gossip, not casual curiosity, but specific information that helps them understand a person's life patterns. You might meet someone who constantly asks questions like, "Where do you live exactly? What time do you usually wake up? When do you leave the house? What problems are you dealing with lately? Who are the closest people in your life?" At first, these questions seem normal. People talk, people share stories. But the difference lies in how persistent the questions become. One former witch admitted that personal details were extremely valuable during occult practices. Names, birth dates, photos, addresses, even emotional struggles. Why? Because the more information someone has, the easier it becomes to focus spiritual attention on a target. This is why some witches spend a lot of time building trusting relationships with people. Not necessarily friendships, but connections that allow them to gather information naturally. They listen carefully. They remember details. They observe routines. And over time, they begin to know things about a person that most strangers would never know. Another ex-witch revealed something even more disturbing. She explained that witches often look for emotional vulnerabilities, moments when someone is grieving, moments when someone feels rejected, moments when someone feels lonely or spiritually disconnected. These are the times when people become more open, more expressive, more willing to share personal pain. And witches know that emotional pain can create spiritual openings. So they listen. They ask gentle questions. They offer sympathy. But behind that sympathy, they are collecting information. Information that can later be used during spiritual rituals or focused negative intention. One testimony described how witches would sometimes keep notebooks filled with personal details about people they interacted with regularly. Names, family members, life struggles, major events. This information became a kind of spiritual map. The more details they had, the easier it became to concentrate their spiritual focus during occult practices. Again, this does not mean every curious person is practicing witchcraft. Discernment is not about suspicion toward everyone. But when someone constantly digs into personal details, when they ask unusual, specific questions, when they remember things about your life that even close friends forget, it is wise to remain cautious about what you share, because information is powerful. And in spiritual warfare, knowledge can become a weapon. Another common tactic ex-witches have described involves gaining access to personal objects, photos, clothing, jewelry, handwritten notes, even small items that belong to someone. These objects can sometimes be used as points of focus during rituals, and that is why some practitioners subtly try to borrow items, request photos, or find ways to obtain personal belongings. Most people never suspect anything. They assume it is harmless. But former practitioners warn that personal items can sometimes be used to create stronger spiritual connections during occult work. This is why many believers today have become more cautious about what they give away and who they give it to. Because once something personal leaves your possession, you cannot always control where it ends up. Now, here is the powerful truth. Darkness relies heavily on access. Access to information, access to personal objects, access to emotional vulnerability. But when someone becomes spiritually aware, access becomes limited. You begin protecting your personal life more carefully. You stop sharing intimate struggles with people you barely know. You stop giving away personal items casually. You stop revealing every detail about your routines. And suddenly, the opportunities for spiritual interference become much smaller. One former witch confessed something very revealing. She said the most difficult people to influence were those who practiced spiritual discipline, people who prayed regularly, people who guarded their words. people who avoided unnecessary gossip, people who did not reveal every detail about their private lives. Why were these people difficult? Because spiritual discipline creates boundaries, and boundaries block access. You must remember this. Spiritual warfare is not only about dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it is about wisdom and protection, knowing when to speak, knowing when to remain silent, knowing who deserves access to your personal life, and knowing when someone's curiosity feels just a little too intense. Because sometimes the questions people ask reveal more about them than the answers you give. The fourth sign is one of the most revealing. And according to former witches, it is often the moment when everything becomes clear. It happens when spiritual authority enters the environment. Many ex-occult practitioners have admitted something fascinating. People deeply involved in witchcraft often react uncomfortably when strong spiritual authority appears around them. Not always dramatically. Sometimes the reaction is subtle. But if you watch carefully, you can see it. For example, someone may appear completely calm during normal conversations, relaxed, confident, in control. But the moment someone begins talking about prayer, faith, or the power of God, their behavior suddenly changes. They may become irritated, dismissive, mocking, or strangely defensive. Why? Because spiritual authority carries power that disrupts dark influence. One former witch described attending a gathering where a believer suddenly began praying out loud. Not loudly, not aggressively, just quietly and sincerely. And yet, she said something inside her became extremely uncomfortable. Her heart began racing, her thoughts became chaotic, and she felt an overwhelming urge to leave the room. She later explained that during her years in witchcraft, prayer was one of the most difficult things for occult practitioners to tolerate. Not because of the words, but because of the spiritual force behind sincere prayer. Prayer activates spiritual authority. It invites divine presence. And when divine presence enters a space, darkness begins losing its influence. This is why some witches react strongly when people speak openly about faith. They may try to laugh it off. They may change the subject quickly. They may suddenly criticize religion. Or they may become unusually quiet and distant. Another ex-witch confessed that when believers carried strong spiritual conviction, it created a kind of pressure around them. She described it like standing too close to a powerful heat source. You cannot stay there comfortably for long. Something pushes you away. That is what strong spiritual authority can feel like to someone operating in darkness. And here is something very important you must understand. Spiritual authority is not about shouting. It is not about dramatic displays. True authority comes from consistent spiritual alignment, prayer, faith, obedience. These things build spiritual strength over time. And when someone walks in that strength, darkness recognizes it immediately. One former practitioner described meeting a quiet elderly woman who prayed daily. She was gentle, soft-spoken, never confrontational. Yet witches in the area avoided her house completely. Why? Because every time they passed near her property, they felt something disturbing. Not disturbing in a harmful way, but disturbing to the darkness they carried. The woman's prayers had created a spiritual barrier. Nothing occult could comfortably operate there. And that reveals a powerful truth. Darkness is bold only when it believes no resistance exists. But when spiritual authority becomes visible, darkness often retreats quickly. This is why some people become strangely hostile when someone begins speaking about God. It is not always simple disagreement. Sometimes it is spiritual resistance. Light exposes things darkness wants to keep hidden. And when exposure begins, reactions follow. But this is where many believers misunderstand spiritual warfare. They think they must confront every suspicious person. They think they must accuse people or start arguments. That is not wisdom. True spiritual authority does not chase darkness. It stands firm in truth. Prayer is stronger than accusations. Faith is stronger than fear. And spiritual discipline creates protection that arguments never could. So when you encounter people who react strongly to spiritual authority, when they become uncomfortable during prayer, when they resist conversations about faith, simply observe. Stay calm. Stay spiritually grounded. Because awareness is powerful, but fear is unnecessary. You are not meant to live worried about witches. You are meant to live confident in the authority that protects you. And when that authority is active in your life, darkness recognizes it immediately. Now you understand something most people never see. Darkness does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides behind ordinary faces, ordinary conversations, ordinary moments. But your awareness has awakened today. You are no longer blind to the signs, and when awareness rises, darkness loses its advantage. Stand firm in faith, in spiritual authority, because when light stands strong, darkness cannot remain.